I want to talk about a new paper that I discuss on my Substack. I'll put a link below. The paper is entitled Association of Child Masking with COVID-19 Related Closures in U.S. Childcare Programs. And I call this Substack post, A New Paper Claims Kids Masking is Associated with More Daycare, Truth or Fiction. It got a lot of retweets. But did the weather vanes read it? So this is an interesting paper. It comes out in JAMA Network Open, and it purportedly claims that if you surveyed people in early 2020 who ran daycares, and you followed up with them about a year later, it turns out that daycares where they report that kids 2 and up always wore the mask, if they say they always wore the mask at baseline, then they are less likely to ever have a single school closure than places that had something less than that. So mostly wore the mask, sometimes wore the mask, never wore the mask, those kinds of things. And the actual difference they saw, they don't tell you the precise numbers, but they give you a rough estimate that the absolute risk reduction is about 5.8%. We're talking at a baseline rate about 42%. So we're really talking about something like 40% of the places that always masked 2-year-olds had 1 or more closure, and 46% of the places that did something less than that had 1 or more closure. That p-value is 0.04. And in this business, 0.04 is winner, winner, chicken dinner. That's a winner. That means you can publish your paper. 0.051, I'm sorry. Try again. 0.04, you're a winner. You have a significant finding. But there are a lot of problems with this paper. It falls apart real quick, and I try to break that down in my analysis. The first thing I noted was what else was significant? Well, it turned out that staff wearing the mask, if the staff always wore the mask, had nothing to do with the rate of closure. So if anything, that could be the headline finding, right? Interesting that it's not. It could have been the headline finding that staff wearing masks, whether they did it or not, had nothing to do with the rate of closure. So babies can see faces. Children can see the adult caretaker faces. But that's not the way they decided to spin their paper. Very little else was significant. So home or center-based childcare, having staggered arrival, temperature checking the kids, the adults, symptom checking the kids, the adults, having them drop off outside, I think was significant in one analysis, but not in the other. Not in the baseline it was significant, but not if you pool the first and last. And county-level prevalence looked like it had something to do with it. So in other words, if you live in a place where there was more SARS-CoV-2, it looks like that there was more likely that you would close, which makes sense, that the more virus is circulating, the more likely you'll close because of the virus. Sure. What were the problems with the study? 1, people made this seem like that this study sanctions the policy that we always need to ensure 2-year-olds and up wear their mask in daycare. But it doesn't test the policy question. Keep that in mind. The policy question would be to see whether or not they had a mandate and whether or not that correlated with being open or closed. Not whether or not the kids actually did it. Because a lot of places could have had a mandate, but the staff who filled out the survey felt like, God, it's really hard to enforce getting 2-year-olds to wear masks all the time. So maybe it's not always, maybe it's mostly. They mostly wore the mask and they filled it out that way. They would be coded as a no mask bucket in this paper, by my understanding of how they're coding their data set. And that doesn't really answer the question because you want to know whether or not the policy trying to do it, knowing that a lot of people will fall short, is better than not even trying to do it, letting people choose what they want to do for their kids, because that's what we're actually debating right now. The other thing is the endpoint we care about isn't school closure that is related to COVID. It's, how many people get sick? What happens to people? Do they do well? Do they do poorly? And how many days are you closed? This is treating like a school that's closed for months the same as a school that's closed for a day. That's all treated the same. I think that's all a big problem with this study. The next problem, the effect size. A lot of people tweeted back at me that, even if this is true, we're talking 40 versus 46% chance of ever closing. I'd rather have my kid be unmasked, and I'll take a 5.8% increased chance. And I was like, it's a small effect size. I don't know if I would necessarily reach that conclusion, but I think this paper doesn't even prove that conclusion, as I'm going to argue in a second. But the effect size is small. I mean, it's a few percentage points. It really shows you could have done a cluster randomized control trial. This ain't a parachute. See, if you fall out of an airplane with a parachute, you have a 99.99997% chance of survival, according to the American Parachuting Society statistics. If you jump out of an airplane without a parachute, you have a 0.000000001% chance of survival. There's just a few fluke case reports in the literature. So the parachute has a big effect size, a 99.9999% effect size. We don't get those effects in biomedicine. And here we have a 5.8% effect size. So it's not in the parachute ballpark. It's not close to a parachute. You shouldn't say the word parachute when you discuss this. This is something that can easily be tested with randomized controlled trials, and it ought to be. I see some people say that, until you do a randomized trial, you can't talk about the harms either. That's not how it works in this world. Randomized trials are there to establish benefits under ideal circumstances. They don't prove harms. For instance, there's never been a randomized trial of somebody getting a gunshot wound to the chest. No one's randomized people to that to prove it's harmful, but we know it's harmful. And similarly, you can deprive people of all sorts of stimuli in all sorts of ways. They're not randomized trials for that, maybe outside of, draconian places, but they're not randomized trials of all those things, but we wouldn't want to do that to somebody. You do randomized trials to show under what circumstances something can benefit somebody. That's the take-home message. 3, it's all self-reported. We're taking the self-reports of somebody at these daycare centers, filling it out. They may not be totally honest. And you can imagine that if you're running a daycare center, you take pride in it. And it is, I hate to say it, we made this a culture issue. It's embarrassing to have to close because of SARS-CoV-2. You might not be totally honest about that question. And it's also embarrassing to admit that you're not masking all the kids there, because that's also considered a virtuous thing to do. So people may not be fully honest in this survey. So how can you really trust it? Number 4, 19,000 people are asked to take this survey, and they're basing their results on 6,000 people who actually submitted both copies. That is a pathetically low response rate, 31%. In most of social science, we would throw out a 30% response rate. They do nothing to prove to you that there's not some massive selection bias in terms of who is responding. And that's enough, in my opinion, to throw out the whole data set. Number 5, adult masking doesn't make any difference. It didn't matter that the adults were masking or not masking, yet they don't decide to trumpet that finding. Surprise, surprise. Which really goes to show you that people just want to find things that confirm their pre-existing beliefs. And in, really malleable observational data sets like this, you can easily do that. Number 6, the authors dichotomize and trichotomize things that are a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, the incidence of SARS-CoV-2 in the county that the daycare center is a numerical value that spans a huge range, but they trichotomize it to put it in 3 buckets. But that actually limits statistical power, and it's not the best way to analyze data, in my opinion. And the other thing is the question is actually more complicated than did they mask, did they not mask? It's actually, did they never mask, some days mask, most days mask, and everyday mask? How are they breaking that apart? Are they saying, yes, the masking is every day, always, 100%, and most is considered no? What is some considered? How many ways can they slice and dice this data? Just think about it. They can present it in all sorts of permutations. They can salami slice it any which way until they get that P of 0.04, and that's a winner. Why are the authors not comparing all of the categories to each other? Like, there should be a dose-response gradient. Never should be the worst, and then some days should be better, and then most days should be better, and then every day should be the best. But they're not presenting the data that way. Number 7, p-value 0.04. This is on the cusp of significance. It's just enough to get your paper, but it doesn't make you feel too good about the findings. What am I to think when I see that you have massive analytical flexibility, that you can present this data in many, many ways? You've dichotomized your variables in ways that I don't see are pre-specified. You're looking at a very skewed endpoint. You don't seem to care about the fact that 60+% of people aren't even returning your survey. I feel as if this is a p-hacking exercise. They're just processing the data in different ways until they get a kind of nice finding, and they trumpet that finding. And meanwhile, they minimize the finding that doesn't fit the preconceived notions that the staff wearing masks didn't matter one bit. That's a problem to me. That's a big problem to me. They also are preferentially presenting the baseline results, but why not the end results? They present baseline and baseline plus follow-up, but not follow-up. In follow-up, 32% of daycare centers are wearing the mask, whereas there's only 8% at baseline, and it's 6% when you look at baseline and follow-up for consistency. Why not look at that 32% of centers at the end of follow-up? They make up some reason not, but you can see massive analytical flexibility. You can find what you want when you have this kind of analytical flexibility. Give me the data set and tell me what you want me to prove. You want temperature checks to win? You want them not to win? Adults to win? Kids to win? You tell me what you want. I guarantee you, within one afternoon, I can deliver you a P of 0.04 with this data set. Any question you want, I'll get you there. I'll get you what you need. I can deliver. Just call me a medical writer for the... No, just kidding. But, that's what it feels like. It feels that way. The follow-up question actually asks the question a little bit differently. I think that's problematic a little bit. Number 8. The closure questions asks you, actually, did you have to close because of COVID issues and the staff, the students, etc.? But that's not the same thing everywhere. You can imagine if you are running a daycare center in a rich municipality where people are pro-toddler masking. They love masking. They also have a deep labor force, and this daycare center's got tons of cash. So if one person calls in sick, we'll call in substitute, and we'll pay them whatever we want. We're a rich daycare center. We can bring in substitutes as much as we want, so it's, less likely for us to close. And we also love toddler masking. And another daycare center might not like masking and not have a lot of resources. And so if one person's out, we gotta close school today because we only have 2 people working or something like that. So we don't even know that these daycare centers have the same policies around closure. So you don't even know that the mask is actually preventing viral transmission in a way that's impacting closure. It could just be an artifact for socioeconomic factors, money that drives the ability, and labor markets that drive the ability of places to stay open. That's a huge problem. And number 9, and the credit goes to the epidemiologist Ali Krug, who pointed this out to me, there's differential attrition. That's a possibility. What does that mean? Of that 19,000 people who could have been in this data set, 6,000 filled out both surveys. There's a lot of loss along the way, and that might not be random loss. It might be loss that is meaningful. In other words, people who are more likely to suffer outbreaks may be more likely to not fill out the second survey. They feel shame. People who are less proud of the fact that they admitted that they weren't masking kids or weren't masking adults. They may be embarrassed to fill it out. You don't know. You don't know who's not filling this out second survey. And as a result, it could have a huge imbalance that's leading to a skewed result that wouldn't exist if you had the full, complete data set, which they don't. So what am I to think when I read this? I don't know. I'm going to close my laptop and actually talk to you for a second. We have a big problem in science. I mean, I see everyone's really upset that a comedian podcaster had some guests who said some things that I think are incorrect. And I agree with that because I wrote an article for Unheard Magazine where I pointed out those things that are incorrect. I also think they said some correct things too. I actually think the average person who has an opinion about that podcaster hasn't actually listened to both episodes because it would take you a long time. I listened to both twice to write my essay in Unheard Magazine, and it took a lot of time to process and to fact check and to do that kind of work. And I don't think they have done it. I think they just are going by their gut, what other people tell them. So we seem to care about misinformation. What are we to think about this paper? This paper is not a strong truth claim. In fact, it's really, really bad. In fact, and it's not being told by a comedian podcaster on a random podcast. This is in a journal, premier journal, and it's being retweeted by many people who, use it to further a narrative that we ought to keep masking these kids in school, despite many, many op-eds that have recently argued that maybe it's time to let go of that policy. It's not really based on good evidence anyway. And it's contrary below the age of 6 to the WHO. And a lot of other nations didn't even mask below the age of 11, like the United Kingdom, for the most part throughout the pandemic. What are we to think of this paper? I think it really speaks to the fact, a few things. One, I think it proves something that I have been saying for a while, which is that the average person talking about these issues is not actually reading the paper that they're tweeting. I suggested that anyone who's been promoting this paper as a truthful claim, you should unfollow them. I mean, that's not a person who's giving you reliable information. They're not processing what they are saying. They're just saying things that fit a narrative. And I really do think they do a great disservice, especially the more titles and accolades that they hold while tweeting this paper. I think this paper shouldn't have been published. I mean, end of story, it's methodologically weak. If it had reached the opposite conclusion that masking didn't help neither group, and if they had trumpeted it that way, I don't think it would have been published. I don't think it would have ever cleared peer review. I don't think anyone would have wanted to take it because that is a poisonous conclusion in the academy. And the moment you have claims like that in science where one idea, one answer is palatable and publishable, and the other answer is not palatable, not publishable, you don't have a fair scientific process. You have a fundamentally skewed scientific process. You insert malleability, lots of variables, lots of ways to slice and dice data. You insert a unidirectional publication filter. You can only publish one result, not the other. You will get a completely distorted published literature. It will be less about the truth and more about an opinion poll or a self-fulfilling prophecy. You'll get what you want. We're going to get another 100 studies that show masking young kids worked. None were cluster randomized trials. The beauty of randomization is when you take a really hot topic like this, there's not much people can do. They have to pre-specify the primary endpoint. They have to tell you the power calculation. They can't game it like that after the fact. Some people try, but it's not as easy as it looks. And then it gives you the answer. I think it's really important. Ironically, the more people go on Twitter and they say, the more they go on social media and they say, like, we cannot do a randomized controlled trial. We don't believe it is ethical to do it. The more that the observational studies that come out of that are unlikely to be truthful because you can see they have such strong passion, such strong sentiment. It's very unlikely that they're actually doing this in an impartial way. I mean, this paper is irredeemably flawed. There's no doubt about that. I showed it to my friend Vlad Kogan, the political scientist. He says, how do things like this get published? Why does nobody talk about the fact that people make careers publishing these kinds of low credibility findings? I'm like, people have been talking about that for a while, but, this is drawing it further into the open. The analysis is not credible. It doesn't persuade you one iota. people say it's like a lot of small evidence amounts to a big pile of evidence. Not if every piece of evidence is garbage. A big pile of garbage is called a dump. It's not called answer. It's not called truth. It's a landfill, a big pile of garbage studies. And that's what we're getting. We're getting landfills of COVID studies. I suspect we'll see the same for lockdowns, school closures, whatever you want. School closure, I think that the sentiment is a little bit more balanced than masking kids, where I think in the academy it's much more skewed. And so I think you'll get more of a skew in masking kids. Closures will be more balanced. Lockdown, I think it's kind of skewed. And so I think you will get more pro-lockdown papers, retrospective observational papers, than you'll get critical of lockdown. But I think the balance on these things will change as we get further from the pandemic and people see it a little bit more clearly. I think the school closure will tip, and then within 15, 20 years, it will be mostly thought of as a net harm. Lockdowns, I think, will start to tip. I describe lockdown as bloodletting. Maybe it works for that hemochromatosis patient, but it probably doesn't work for most patients. So why'd you bloodlet everybody, including George Washington? It's really kind of a crude intervention. The masking, I don't know where it's going to settle. I mean, people really see it so much as an identity badge, and they really like it. They're seduced by it. They're not persuaded to stop. I don't think they'll ever stop in some circumstances. Some people might wear it indefinitely or want to perpetuate it. I do think it's a real huge failure that we didn't do cluster randomized control trials here, and we're settling for evidence like this, which is getting news coverage, by outlets that mostly have already decided that this is the answer. And that's why no one's reading the paper clearly. So, I don't know. It's not good. It's not good for science. Science it's going to tear itself in two. I mean, we have always had these kinds of problems on all sorts of issues, from beta carotene to cancer screening to whatever. They never had this kind of audience. You didn't have the world interested in these questions. You didn't have hundreds of millions of Americans interested in these questions, and it didn't have a political valence to it. It wasn't associated with Democrats, pro-beta carotene, Republicans, anti-beta carotene, etc. You have all that now, and what that's going to lead to is, I think it's going to rip in half. Science will rip in half. The only way to heal it is simple. When there are disputes with people who are often political opponents, when there are real disputes about evidence, we have to run prospective randomized studies. It's the only way to settle this. These kinds of observational studies, they're not going to settle it. If this paper reached the opposite conclusion, it wouldn't prove masks didn't work. I hate to break that to you. As much as I'm critical of it, it wouldn't prove that because it's not capable of proving anything. It shouldn't have been performed. We need to run the experiments. There needs to be a research agenda. The CDC should not be making these blanket recommendations. They should be telling you what randomized trials they're running and when they will result to give you information. We are acting as primitive as the people who lived through the Great Plagues of Europe. And I don't know. It's sad. It's 2022 and we're still like this. So I'm disappointed. Science failed. Follow the science. It led you to the dumpster it led you to the dump, and there's tons of garbage everywhere, and that's what we're calling the COVID-19 literature. So that's where the follow the science got us. So on that positive note, you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Follow me on Substack. Until next time.